Hi there. Glad you could make it. Just happened to come across these things the other day in the attic, and it's amazing how the memories associated with them start to flow back. This photo album in particular. Most of the pictures in it I took with this 35mm camera that I carried on all my missions. It was quite a thing at those days. Well, then suddenly it occurred to me that it might be interesting to put them all together and document a few of the many and there I was stories that go along with them. So for what it's worth, here's what I came up with. And I thought the best place to start would be the day I graduated from Bombardier School in Deming, New Mexico.
It's hard to believe this was me at the time. And here is the parade ground where it all took place. In this picture stands 83 survivors out of an original class of 900. By some stroke of luck, I managed to be one of them. Yes, about 90% never made it to graduation. On this day, we were required to stand at rigid attention in sweltering 120-degree heat, while the colonel droned on and on about how lucky we were to have reached this point. Movement of any kind was prohibited, even while stinging, salty beads of sweat rolled down from under the sweatbands of our hats and into our eyes. And then there was the ever-present miniature tornadoes we called dust devils. They swirled unrelentingly right through the assembly, tossing plumes of sand everywhere, some even caked on our sweat-soaked faces. And in the middle of it all, we heard a resounding thud that sounded like a cabbage had been thrown hard to the ground. It was the head of one of the cadets that had passed out. But no one dared move, because if he was lucky enough to come to and stand up without any help, all was forgiven and he graduated. Otherwise, the size of the graduating class was reduced by one. And even without pausing, the colonel kept elaborating on what an elite group we were, the best of the best, and how indebted we should be to our instructors. Our instructors, they were nothing more than airborne equivalents to Marine drill sergeants. They screamed and shouted at us on every flight and tried their damnedest to make us fail. As far as we could determine, their only goal was to achieve the government-mandated washout rate of 90%. Thank God those miserable days of bouncing over the hot desert in these AT-11s were over. Then over the loudspeaker came the colonel's concluding words. By order of the government, you are now officers and gentlemen. Had to laugh when he said gentlemen. Can't remember anything they gave us or tried to teach us on how to become a gentleman. Anyway, we threw our sweat-soaked cadet hats high in the air and cheered like idiots. And without stopping, we reached into our pockets, pulled out this gold lieutenant's bar, and pinned it to our collars. It was followed by the placement of these silver bombardier's wings on the top of the left shirt pocket. And when complete, each turned to the other and mutually gave his first official salute as an officer. At that moment, we were literally bubbling over with excitement, wondering what was ahead of us. Our heads were figuratively in the clouds as illustrated here, and we couldn't wait to get into combat, or at least say goodbye to this place. Well, that wait was over in minutes when they handed us travel orders dispersing us to bomber crew training bases throughout the United States. Oddly enough, I was sent just 50 miles down the road to Biggs Army Airfield, just outside the Mexican border of the town of El Paso, Texas. 5 of us squeezed into a cab to be sure we would be the first to arrive. I can remember the thrill I got when we approached the front gate. Through the fence we saw for the first time a real B-17. Compared to an AT-11, it looked like a monster. Guns were sticking out all over it. and it truly justified its title as a flying fortress. It was then that I realized this was to be my future home in the sky for a long time to come. The thought kind of hit me like a bucket of ice water. Well, after checking in and finding our assigned barracks, we were told to report to the main assembly room at 0600 the next day. That's when I met my future combat crew members shown in this picture. These are the guys I would be depending on for my survival over hostile Germany. I am second from the left in the back. All of us were under 21, except for Baker and Brittman, the two on the right in the front row. They were different from us, being hardened combat veterans who had already completed a full tour of combat missions in the Pacific. And frankly, we felt much safer than the other guys, having them as part of our crew. We later found out that in civilian life, Baker, on the extreme right, was a Golden Gloves boxing champion, and Britton, a Las Vegas card dealer. And boy, what he could do with a deck of cards. Their stated reason for signing up for more hazardous missions over Germany was they simply couldn't stand for what all GIs called the stateside bureaucratic chicken shit. 10 men constituted a standard B-17 crew, but in case you didn't notice, there were only 9 in the picture. The missing member was our co-pilot. He deliberately chose to absence himself because he had a hot date and, quote, couldn't waste time taking such a stupid picture. Not a good start for the so-called crew bonding we were supposed to achieve. And as might be expected, he quickly managed to alienate himself from every crew member, pulling stunts like borrowing money and not paying back, or in my case, it was the wearing of my just laundered shirts without asking. Without a doubt, he became the ultimate crew pariah, and we, unfortunately, were saddled with him. Nevertheless, we focused our minds on daily classroom lectures and simulated combat flying exercise, some taking place even at night. Dropping bombs from a B-17 was found to be very different from that of an AT-11 because the ship moved like a lumbering elephant and side-slipped all over the sky while trying to synchronize on the practice range targets. Well, after about 2 weeks of these unrelenting demands, we were issued a Cinderella pass. That is one where you had to be back by midnight. Well, being northern city boys, we were anxious to experience the wilds of Juarez, Mexico we had heard so much about. Some of the barrack stories being tossed about were unbelievable. On our way out the gate, we were warned to be sure and stay in groups and avoid side streets. It seems roving gangs of zoot suitors were routinely beating up GIs at the time and stealing their money. Not wishing to run into them, we made sure to patronize only the large stores on the main street. The items most of us sought were Chanel No. 5 perfume that was smuggled in from France and nylon stockings. Both could not be found in the U.S. and were considered a very special present to be sent home to a mother, wife, or sweetheart. It also was the time when the now rare $2 bill originated. It's because Germany was smuggling vast amounts of counterfeit currency across the U.S. borders, hoping to undermine our economy. However, for some unknown reason, they weren't able to copy the $2 bill. So we therefore were required to change everything we had in our pockets into $2 bills before we went over, and then change back later if we so desired. Here's one of them that I saved. Well, after we tired of shopping, we indulged in a sumptuous dinner, and of course, sampled a little too much of their fiery tequila, which we promptly renamed as Tequila. Somehow we made it back okay, but the next day all of us came down with what everyone euphemistically called Montezuma's revenge. couldn't venture far from the latrine the entire day, so by nightfall we were so weak we could hardly stand up. But sure enough, that's when we were ordered to go on a long-distance celestial navigation mission. And at night, and we had to go all the way north to somewhere around Seattle, Washington, and back. Well, you couldn't imagine our consternation. What a sad sack-looking crew we were going to that Flight 9. Well, as soon as we got airborne, we set the plane on the required heading, clutched in the autopilot, and collapsed into a deep sleep, hoping that at least one of us would stay partially awake. About 3 hours later, someone came on the intercom and shouted, "I can see lights below, must be Seattle." This jolted the navigator to semi-awakeness, who replied, "What do you mean Seattle? That's El Paso." Well, we had inadvertently set the autopilot in a barely detectable right turn and were flying in one huge circle the whole time. No one dared mention the error when we landed. At the time of this accelerated training phase, we were classified as combat ready and sent northward to a snowy, cold Lincoln, Nebraska base for a special assignment. The assignment was to ferry over some just off the production line B-17s to England. We felt privileged to have been selected for the task. 10 other crews were scheduled to fly over with us as a group in B-17G models that looked like this. They had incorporated quite a few combat-requested improvements, the most noticeable being the addition of a chin turret and the removal of the traditional olive-drab paint. This paint removal lightened the plane by 200 pounds, but the chin turret added close to 300. It also created noticeable drag and slowed the plane down by at least 10 miles an hour. The night before takeoff, everything was checked out and ready to go. All our gear had been stowed in our assigned aircraft, and our pulse rates were elevated in anticipation of takeoff. All we had to do was wait for the sun to pop up over the horizon, and off we would go. But that's when our co-pilot walked in and glibly announced, "Surprise, fellas! I've got VD and can't go with you." "What?" came the unified response. Well, he told us the base doctors had ordered him to stand down for 7 days while they administered the usual series of penicillin shots in the hospital. I can still hear his nonchalant words as he walked away. "Relax, guys, I'll be seeing you." Well, now, as an incomplete crew, we were immediately scratched from the fly-off list and redirected to New York to, of all things, go over by boat. Talk about being mad. We were ignominiously relegated to going over by boat just like all the others. And if that wasn't enough, when he came back after the 7 days, he tauntingly said, "Can't understand it. She was such a nice girl, and even showed me a health certificate to prove it." Well, during our long sojourn to the New York docks, we got wind of a shocking, but what turned out to be true rumor. All the ships that took off from Lincoln that fateful day ran into a catastrophic North Atlantic storm, and every one of them had disappeared into the iceberg-strewn waters without a trace. Well, after hearing that, we weren't so mad at our co-pilot anymore. Yep, the son of a gun had actually saved us from an icy grave. Well, upon our arrival at the New York docks, we saw the Queen Mary on one side and an old rusty hulk called the Ile-de-France on the other. We joined the long line stretching far out in front of us, heading toward the Queen. But just as we were about to climb the gangplank, we were stopped and turned toward the Ile-de-France. The new orders were to load the Ile-de-France to maximum capacity first. Well, aside from the disappointment, it quickly became apparent No one knew what the capacity was, so they kept loading more and more bodies until the decks looked like this. As soon as we departed, it became very apparent there weren't enough beds, much less lifeboats, to accommodate the overflow. Temporary bunks were strung up like these, which left little more than 12 inches between each tier, and getting in and out of them was an acrobatic feat which many could not accomplish. And adding to the discomfort was the ship's excessive rolling and heaving. It had a round hull and no stabilizers, so with each wave it would soar high in the air and roll over to a point where you swore it was going to capsize. With few exceptions, retaining any consumed food was close to impossible. Those on deck would simply rush to the railing and toss up. But those in the bunks, all they could do was lean over and barf in the aisle. Well, you can imagine the stench after 10 days. This rolling and heaving was further exacerbated when we had to start zigzagging to avoid German submarines like this that were reported in the area. Sinking a troop ship like ours would certainly have been a feather in their cap. Well, when we finally reached our Scotland port of entry, they attempted to maneuver the ship through the shallow glades of the Firth of Clyde, just downstream of Glasgow. Overloaded as we were, it was soon realized the ship could not reach the docks, so they dropped anchor in the middle of the bay and commandeered launches to take us the rest of the way. Rope ladders like these were lowered over the sides, and we were told to climb down, regardless of what we were carrying. And when you came to the last rung, you were supposed to jump off. So in the semi-darkness and thick fog that surrounded us, some jumped off at the wrong time and almost drowned. Well, once on land, we were marched about 5 miles to a Glasgow railroad station. Here they put us on a train like this. It moved at a snail's pace down the central part of England, as shown here, and stopped at every hamlet on the map. And right in the middle of it, the afternoon, it even stopped for the train conductor's sacred English tea time. We watched them get off the train, sit down on the embankment, and enjoy their tea and crumpets for at least an hour. As a result, we didn't reach the Kimbolton Air Station until well after midnight. By then, thick, wet fog and impenetrable blackness completely enveloped us. We blindly jumped off the train and sank into ankle-deep mud. This was followed by sloshing through more of it for what seemed like miles. Finally, a faint outline of a Quonset hut came into view. "This is your new home," barked the sergeant. "Take any bed with a rolled-up mattress on it." Later found these were the beds vacated the day before by someone who hadn't returned from a mission. They jokingly were referred to as dead men's beds. Some of the guys swore they were still warm. What a welcoming that was. Well, nothing happened until about 3 a.m. 3 days later. At that time, I heard a clashing of a trash can lid and then a voice shouting, "Now hear this. The following are on today's mission. Sound off when you hear your name." Well, mine was one of them. That big day had finally arrived, and I started breathing a lot faster than usual. Upon dressing, I found my uniform wet and clammy from the ubiquitous fog that had penetrated every corner of the Quonset. Most of us, exiting, climbed on bicycles and sped off to the distant chow hall. For me, the walk was slow and tortuous. This was remedied a few days later when I bought an old rusty one from an old-timer who probably didn't own it in the first place. Well, at the chow hall, the menu invariably consisted of hard rolls, powdered eggs, black coffee, and powdered milk. It was well known that one of the permanent staff got around this powdered milk thing by renting a cow from a nearby farmer and had some farmer boy sergeant deliver him his still warm, fresh milk. After chow, we moved out across the way to this briefing room. Once inside, I began looking for my crew. When I asked where they might be, I got that "how stupid can you get" look, and listened to somewhat amazed when they said, "In this outfit, you fly with anyone who needs a replacement," and that's almost always. All that stuff they taught you about crew bonding is just one big joke. Found out that more and more empty crew slots were being created by those killed, shot down, or lucky enough to have completed their missions and gone home. At the front of the briefing room was a black drape. It was drawn aside to reveal the target for the day. It always evoked moans and "oh no" comments. Target descriptions and objectives were expounded upon by the operations officer, along with caveats concerning expected flak and fighters. Then out again into the ever-present rain and fog. Some stopped by a small chapel room we had at the base where a priest, minister, and a rabbi gave their final blessings for a safe and successful mission. Always seemed odd how our sixth commandment, "Thou shalt not kill," could be countermanded by a blessing to go out and do just the opposite. Most of us just groped our way along and boarded waiting GI trucks like this. The one I climbed into drove for miles before dropping me off at the hard stand where our assigned plane was parked. It had the words "4 of a kind" painted on her nose, so I claimed her as my own. It was quite a famous one because it had been christened by the Queen and her daughter, as shown here. Also present that same day was the famous General Doolittle, who led the first raid on Japan. Well, records show Hitler was determined to outdo his accomplishment and had 3 long-range bombers like this specifically built to do essentially the same thing. Instead of Tokyo, his target was to be the New York island of Manhattan. It came very close to happening, but thankfully, in the process of our bombing other targets, we accidentally destroyed all of them before they ever got off the ground. As to my position in the aircraft, it was right here in this goldfish bowl of a nose. Below me was the chin turret, and on each side what they called cheek guns. Although the presence of the chin turret discouraged many German fighter head-on attacks, it rarely, if ever, worked. As to the cheek guns, they were removed because you couldn't point them forward or see anything through these small windows. A similar condition nullified the utility of the gun in the radio room ceiling. All you could see through its window was the tail, so it also was removed. Well, after the GI truck dropped us off at the hard stand, the first thing we would do is perform the task called pulling the props through. Although it may sound odd, we actually came to think of these metal conglomerates as live, willful things. To be sure and return safely from a mission, you always had to chant as you pushed each blade, "You know we love you, so be good to us today, lady, and bring us back in one piece." The other vital ritual we practiced was getting rid of that black coffee you had for breakfast. You see, no toilets within the plane were accessible once you became lashed to the oxygen line, the heating suit cord, and the intercom lines, not to mention the 50-pound flak suit. My entrance into the nose was up through this escape hatch. It required the physical ability to do a chin-up as shown here, which wasn't easy coming back from a sleepless weekend pass. Next came the start your engines time. One by one, you could first hear the whine of the starter, followed by each cylinder firing away. As others added to the cacophony, it sounded like you were being engulfed with an approaching earthquake. We then moved out onto the taxi strip inched our way toward this gypsy caravan. The squeal of the brakes could repeatedly be heard each time we got too close to each other. Since thick fog obfuscated visual contact with the tower, it became the caravan master's job to supervise the mass exodus. Beside flashing the green light to initiate our takeoff, it became imperative that he help us become perfectly aligned with the runway. With thick, milky fog completely surrounding us, we sometimes weren't sure if we were even on the runway. Perfect centering and alignment was essential, because starting off at the slightest angle was sure to result in an end-over-end crash halfway down the runway, as illustrated here. Well, just before we initiated our roll, brakes would be locked and all 4 engines revved up to full power. The green light flashed, off we would go, plunging, totally blind, through a solid white cloud. The only reference to our surroundings we had was this speedometer. It had to reach at least 110 miles for liftoff, or else we would end up a tangled mess of metal and burning fuel. Somehow we always managed to lift off just before reaching the end of the runway, and then swallowed hard and said a prayer of thanks. Having survived that ordeal, the next requirement was to search the sky for others in the group who were circling for the same reason. And while doing this, we never forgot that over 1,000 other aircraft were also arising from airfields shown here as a red dot. Mid-air collisions were bound to happen, and many did. Although our distinctive yellow triangle on the tail was easily discernible on the ground, from a distance all B-17s looked alike. So to facilitate the assembly task, we dreamed up this distinctive spotter ship around which we all formed. As soon as all ships were in place, it would peel off and be replaced by the lead ship. The B-24 groups heard about it and started painting theirs like this. Well, after forming a long line of over 1,000 planes, we headed out across the channel and started what took about 2 hours to climb to about 27,000 feet. In the process, 2 survival provisions became mandatory. One was the need for oxygen, because 5 minutes without it and you collapsed, and 10 minutes more and you were dead. And 2, you had to have something to keep you from freezing in the 60-degree below zero environment. Well, here was the solution. Electrically heated jackets, pants, and shoes, all wired the same way electric blankets are today. Unfortunately, the original design had wires in it that would break right in the pants crotch. This would cause a welding torch-type arc to burn right through the crotch covering. Need I say more? The shoes worked great, but had to be covered with a black felt boot like you see Baker, our top turret gunner, putting on here. They were supposed to be worn only when in the aircraft. So to make sure this ridiculous rule was adhered to, the government directed the manufacturer to make the shoes out of cardboard so they would fall apart on wet ground. Couldn't believe it. No thought was given to their use if you had to quickly bail out or were shot down. Most of us refused to wear them, or at least carried along our sturdy GI boots. Well, now as we continued to climb, long streams of white vapor trails would begin to form behind each engine. We called them condensation or simply contrails. They were caused by the hot engine exhausts crystallizing the moisture in the air. These trails could be seen for miles and therefore alerted the flak gunners long before we reached our targets. Scattered black puffs of flak explosions would usually begin appearing to the left and right. Then they slowly merged in front to form what they called a barrage box, as illustrated here. It was like flying into a minefield of 4th of July type explosions, only without the colors. getting through it appeared next to impossible. Each shell or explosion was equivalent to about 20 hand grenades, and when detonated from inside, it threw hundreds of deadly shrapnel shards sent flying in all directions, and it only took one of them to bring down a B-17. If you were lucky not to be torn apart by a direct hit, the blast waves would bounce you about like a falling leaf in a rainstorm. Other times it felt like they were throwing buckets of gravel at you. Thin slivers of sunlight would often appear through holes left by shrapnel entering one side of the aircraft and exiting the other. Here is a series of foolhardy shots I took showing how German flak gunners refined their aim as we proceeded down the bomb run. The third frame here shows our left wing man receiving a direct hit. It exploded, flipped over, and went into a spiraling death dive. No shoots were seen to come out. Well, after a few missions like that, you couldn't help but become a little jumpy. The psychologists at the base called it combat fatigue, which they divided into 3 stages. This was supposedly stage 2. Stage 1 was when you arrived and thought you were invincible. And stage 3 was when you became certain you were going to die before it was all over. Landing after each mission was another challenge, because airfields were almost always completely socked in with clouds and fog. And that's when the British radar navigation system, codenamed G, became vital. It was supplied with special maps that had overlaid concentric circles radiating out from 2 transmitting stations. Blips appearing on the screen corresponded to each circle. You simply counted how many blip circles you were from the 2 stations, and where they intersected, that's where you were. Got so adept at it, I could easily talk the pilot right over the end of the runway. If we were still in formation, the lead ship's left wingman would peel off first, as shown here. Others would follow, making one huge circle of nose-to-tail planes, screeching their tires as they hit the macadam. Anyone with wounded or excessive battle damage would, of course, have priority. Some made it, and some didn't. Well, to placate our frazzled nerves after each mission, they almost always gave us a standard package of treats. It consisted of 5 Hershey chocolate bars, 2 shots of Scotch whiskey, and a full carton of Camels. Lots of trading usually took place depending on preferences. Probably the reason why many of us today have ended up as fat alcoholic smokers. Once in a while, gatherings like this were held to award air medals, DFCs, and Purple Hearts. And if the weather over Germany was predicted to be bad for a few days, they gave us a 2 or 3 day pass. Most headed straight for London to get thoroughly sloshed and forget that the next mission might be their last. Some even chose to seek the company of congenial ladies like these we called Piccadilly Commandos.
Charlie boy, how'd you feel?
Well, since German V-1 buzz bombs and V-2 rockets were now arriving in ever-increasing frequency, I chose to explore England by going northward. On one occasion, the end of the line for this train was the town of Nottingham. With the help of this young man, I was able to locate a place to sleep. It was called the Norweb House, but the interesting part was the master of the house, Sir Norweb, was the actual official Sheriff of Nottingham, which would be our equivalent of a city mayor. Despite the prevailing image that all Yanks were, quote, overpaid, oversexed, and over here, they treated me as an honored guest. I, in turn, did all I could to convince them that all Yanks weren't like that. Can't forget those warm baths upon arrival, the soft feather bed, the aroma of fresh bread in the mornings, plus once to the local flicks, where I remember seeing this haunting movie called Laura. Oh, and I must not forget the trips to the close-by pub called the Ye Old Admiral Rodney. Wasn't very good at darts there, but found I could do quite well at the British bar-top game called Shove a Penny. You whacked large copper pennies forward with the ball of the thumb. The rules were almost the same as for American shuffleboard. Also got to like the warm British beer called Half and Half, pronounced arf and arf. And of course, I returned as often as I could. But each time I had to depart from this Nottingham station, I was always mentally confronted with a serious stay or go dichotomy. Switching back from a carefree, serene existence to one of death and destruction was hard to take. However, the overwhelming desire to finish my missions and go home always won out, so back I went. Couldn't believe how lucky I was on succeeding missions when, for instance, a piece of flak came right up through the navigator's table, exactly where my head was a moment before, or when I directed the pilot to make a sudden 45-degree turn and a burst appeared right where we would have been had we gone straight. On the other lighter side, the personal relief procedures we practiced might be well worth noting. We discovered that liquids of any kind would instantly freeze at 60 degrees below zero cabin temperatures. So when you had to pee, you simply did so in your flak helmet. But even before you were finished, it became solid ice. So you just knocked out the resultant cake of ice and put the helmet right back on your head. If you had to go the other way, the you-know-what was deposited in an ammo box that we always made sure to have available. The box was placed on top of the bombs, and out it went at bombs away. This worked fine until the day we used a lightweight cardboard box. The bombs then went straight down as expected, but the flimsy box tumbled straight back and splattered its contents all over the ball turret's faceplate. Then there was the mission where the protective powers of the Almighty seemed to take over. The target was the railroad marshalling yards in the center of Cologne. As can be seen in this photo, the tracks were no more than a few feet from the majestic, towered Cathedral of Cologne. Its spires sometimes poked above the clouds and provided the ideal target identifier for the crosshairs of our bomb sites. Mission after mission, we went there and flattened everything around it. But never once did a bomb hit the towers. They stand untouched today as they had for hundreds of years before the war. Think about it. Although each mission never failed to have their high-tension moments, it was on my 34th, that's the next to last mission, where I came closest to saying goodbye to this world. We were headed straight for Berlin that day, with a planned last-minute turn northward to the town of Oranienburg. On the bomb run, some flak hit one of the engines and it had to be feathered. This loss of power made us lag behind, and when the usual quick left turn after bombs away took place, it whipped us way out and far behind the formation. Our lame duck situation was the perfect scenario German fighters loved to see. It attracted them like sharks go for blood. Even so, we weren't too worried because the German Air Force was essentially out of business at that time. So we thought. I first sensed something ominous was about to happen when our top turret gunner started firing. Sure enough, within seconds I was violently thrown across the nose and smashed against the oxygen tank on the wall. Then I was rolled upside down and pinned helpless to the ceiling. Every part of me was stuck there. I couldn't even move my head. Well, we had been attacked by the world's first operational jet fighter. I couldn't believe at the time that a plane could fly without a propeller. Well, not one but two ME-262s appeared out of nowhere and fired a salvo of these rockets into our right wing. Their impact and subsequent explosions caused the ship to flip over and start into what we call the death dive. As I hung there looking at the floor, I couldn't help thinking, so this is what it's like to die. Then closely tightened my eyes and waited for the second explosion, which was sure to occur. It would blow the plane apart. I had seen it happen to others and expected it any second. Nothing happened. So what was taking so long? For God's sakes, get it over with, I screamed. Suddenly, the invisible force of my arms eased up, and I was plopped hard down on the floor. For some miraculous reason, we had rolled back upright and were able to pull out of the dive. But that's not the end of it. Way out in the distance, the two ME-262s could be seen circling around, getting ready to come in and finish us off. In desperation, we fired every distress flare we had in the ship. And then whoosh, like a ghost out of the mist, appeared this old beat-up P-47. He apparently could see the ME-262s heading our way and defiantly placed himself directly between us and them. Rather than ramming him, they peeled off and disappeared in the clouds below. Not only did he save us, he escorted our vibrating hulk all the way out of Germany, tossed us a salute goodbye, and departed by doing a beautiful victory roll never to be seen again. When we landed, men came rushing from all over the base to reportedly see the first aircraft to survive an ME-262 attack. It seems one of their rockets had entered the wing and exploded inside, opening the trailing edge like a clamshell as shown here. The central spar was the only thing holding the wing in place. At the debriefing, we found we had been reported shot down, a statement that's never been corrected in the record. Well, without any rest, I was sent up the very next day on my last mission. Fortunately, it was a milk run, that is, no flak, no fighters. But by this time, I was absolutely convinced I was not going to make it. I believed through some stroke of luck I had dodged death the day before, so it was sure to happen today. I was clearly a stage 3 psycho case. My hands shook so badly I couldn't even make entries into the navigation log. I just sat semi-paralyzed, staring blankly at the bulkhead throughout the whole mission. Upon landing, all I can remember is dropping out of the nose, forgetting the debriefing, and walking in a daze back to my sack. And that's where I stayed, they said, for 2 days. I recall being shook into consciousness by someone saying, "Did I know I was on the ship out list?" That meant I was going home. I jumped out of the sack with pure joy. But before departing, I made sure to attend this traditional dunking of the pilot in the cold water reservoir we had at the base. You can see he took it in good humor. The next move was from Gibraltar to some unknown base on the west coast. It was here where they gathered men from other bases who had also completed their tour of missions. True to the government proverb, hurry up and wait, that's where we sat, as one monotonous day after the other just never seemed to end. Almost every hour on the hour, I would check this departure board to see if my name was on it. I played some basketball to kill the time, but mostly caught up on reading. Finally, my name did show up. I immediately packed everything I had in my B4 bag and placed it in this final inspection line as shown here. It was a slow process because we were required to stay with our bags and fill out a mountain of paperwork. From here, the bags and us were transported to the docks. Upon arrival, the bags went one way and we the other. I wondered if but would ever see them again. But right in front of us was a converted cargo ship that smelled like it'd been ferrying cattle. But we didn't care. We were going home. Preparations for cast off at sundown were proceeding reasonably well when all of a sudden everything came to a halt. Cheering, singing, and band playing could be heard coming from the adjacent town. It was May 8th, 1945, VE Day, the historic day they declared victory in Europe. The ship's crew immediately took off to join the merriment, but thankfully managed to return and get us out to sea the next morning. Standing on that deck, smelling the fresh air and knowing I was going home was exhilarating. All I could think about was getting married to my high school sweetheart, who, by the way, is still with me today. The crossing was uneventful, but at dawn on the 8th day, we were awakened by silence. The constant throbbing of the engines had ceased, and we discovered we were sitting still in the middle of the New York harbor. All decks immediately became a mass of bodies, straining to see the almost forgotten skyline of tall buildings. Boats of all shapes and sizes surrounded us and started pushing us toward land. Bands began playing, pretty girls were throwing kisses, and huge arcs of water were spewed across our bow by fireboats. And right in the middle of it all, there was a boat that had a banner hung on its side which read, "Good job, well done." It was truly an emotional moment that words cannot begin to convey. And then, out of the corner of my eye, I spotted the Statue of Liberty, just a little spire in the center of this picture. It was more than I could handle. Tears started streaming down my cheeks. More than any other symbol, it said I was home. Home to a place I thought I would never see again. A country I had been risking my life to protect. The greatest nation in this world, our United States of America.
52% perished over enemy territory, never to see their homes or loved ones again. We shall never forget them.
Well, that is my story. Till we meet again, I'm John McCARLEY.